Journals these days won't take any kind of case reports on problems caused by pills. They only want clinical trials which show that the treatments work. They want clinical trials that look like this. And this is the key clinical trial that was done in kids. This has a huge list of authors, and these are all very big names in the field, and it's in a very, very good journal. And what this particular clinical trial concluded was that this drug works very well for kids and is safe. The experts that you see on the authorship line there were happy to get up at meetings, huge meetings, 200 or 300 people in the hall, and say, yes, we've been involved in this particular clinical trial, and this drug works and works well for kids. It's only when we get to see the raw data that we realize that the drug didn't work for kids and was extremely hazardous. How did this get written up the way it is? How come all of these experts concluded that the pill worked and that there aren't any risks? Well, they didn't write the article. Most of the clinical trials you read these days are ghost-written, at least all the ones that appear in all of the major journals. Look over on the right there, and you see that what you've got here is 2 Zoloft PTSD trials. And on the right, it says, in the case of the first one, that the paper has been completed. And then if you go down, you'll see first draft of the paper is completed. And you'll see that of these 2 clinical trials, one's going to go to the New England Journal of Medicine, and the other's going to go to JAMA. And you'll see over on the left, author TBD, to be determined. The company has the actual article written. They're then going to go back and have a look, well, who would be good names for us to have on this article? Who will help move the product? Why does this count in this particular debate? Well, it counts for this reason. That's the distribution of the suicidal acts that happened in the clinical trials of these 3 drugs here, as you've heard from Joe, 15, 16 years ago. Okay, this is how the data looked when you get to see the raw data. What you're going to see on the next slide is how the companies and FDA reviews of these drugs and all of the journal articles on these drugs report the data that you see there. And that's how it's reported. That's what the clinical trial literature looks like. That's what ghostwriting can do for you. In the case of the FDA reviews, of course, these things aren't ghostwritten. The companies say, well, we did this because FDA actually got to see us doing it, and they didn't think we were doing anything wrong. And in fact, if you look at the FDA reviews, that's just what they've done as well. So FDA can't plead ghostwriting. But this is even more interesting, and you aren't going to see this elsewhere in a hurry, I think, because this is a very inconvenient bit of data for the FDA. 3.5 years ago now, FDA actually looked at all of the data that they've just looked at here and came to a very different conclusion as to what was going on. These are the data that they put out, which is data on completed suicides from the placebo-controlled trials. And you see in the case of all of the antidepressants that they look at, that there's a clearly increased risk on all of the groups of drugs compared to placebo. Now, in the data that FDA put out in a very obscure journal, one in which they were hoping that the world wouldn't actually pick it up, and on which they haven't been asked, or they haven't actually been happy to answer any questions since. They, however, handled the actual problem that you see there on the left by saying, well, if we control for age and sex and location of the trial, we can get the problem to go away, as you see on the right. Trouble is, if you have to recontrol for age and sex, which are controlled by virtue of the fact that these are controlled trials, that all the patients have actually been randomized to each of the arms, if you have to recontrol for age and sex, it hints at the fact that the actual trials may have been very seriously flawed. And the evidence that we have that the drugs work at all perhaps needs to be looked at again. If you look at the issue of location of the trial, this year FDA claimed that we find that there are fewer completed suicides in the clinical trials that have happened here in the US compared with the clinical trials that happened elsewhere. Why might this be? Well, you perhaps have heard or have heard in the past that there are people here in the US who were involved in these clinical trials who've ended up in jail because they put fake kind of patients into the trials. There's an awful lot of things you can do with a fake person when you put them into the trial. You can rate them weekly. They will typically improve. The one thing they won't do is they won't commit suicide because it's inconvenient for the audit trail. Does this explain the results you see here? FDA haven't been actually prepared to answer the question. This is the data that you've seen from Joe. This is the data that they got over in the UK. If you look at the completed suicides from these drugs here, they weren't given actually the completed suicides for Prozac. What you got was data that looks like this, a 2.5-fold increased risk of actually completed suicides in the placebo-controlled trials for these drugs. If you add to that the actual data for both the people who went on to kill themselves and the people who went on to clearly harm themselves, what you see here is an increased risk for these drugs, a 2.4-fold, a 2.4-fold increase in the risk. And this is clearly significant.